Hej och välkomna till den första utgåvan kan man säga av en ny serie som planeras för fullt här i Göteborg. Och serien kommer att heta Vår tids tänkare. Det är ett samarbetsprojekt mellan Göteborgs Litteraturhus, mellan Folkuniversitetet, Bokförlaget Daidalos och också tidskriften Ord&Bild som jag är en av redaktörerna för. Jag heter Ann Ighe. Det är också så, och det tänker jag är lite relevant för det vi ska göra idag, att jag har ett annat professionellt liv då jag är ekonomihistoriker på Göteborgs universitet. Men nu kommer jag gå över på att prata engelska och det ska jag göra med ekonomen Kate Raworth. So, Kate, I will go on. I introduced a project, but now I want to introduce you. I'm happy that in your homepage you tell us that your surname is to be pronounced Rayworth. I must admit that I've said Raworth quite a few times when I've been speaking about you. But you are an economist. You even self identify as a renegade economist. Maybe you would like to tell us a bit more about that. You're focused on exploring how we could socially and ecologically change the way we live and the place where we live. That might be a way to in a shorthand present you as an economist. You're a senior research associate at Oxford University at the Environmental Change Institute. And you've also, and this I'm a bit curious about, you're also professor of practice at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, which I find extremely exciting. Is that an okay introduction of yourself?
That's an amazing introduction, and it's all true. And it's lovely to meet you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And by the way, lots of English people say my name in a funny way as well. It's that funny English spelling. We spell words in ways that nobody can guess to pronounce, not even people from England. So don't worry about it. It doesn't. It
No, but
doesn't
it's also interesting that you have those different spellings and so on. Anyway, I wanted to maybe just start asking. I guess you're in Britain, and just how are things where you are? What's life like?
Oh, well, like many people, I've spent the vast majority of days of the last year in the building I'm in right now. I'm sitting in my little study in my home in Oxford, where I live in East Oxford. And in fact, today, this date, I was thinking about it because it was this day last year that I took my last trip before everything shut
Okay.
down. I was at the European Commission in Brussels, where we had a 2-day workshop with people from across the European Commission who are saying, we want to create the donut for Europe. We want to bring it to be a tool at the heart of the work of the Commission. We had a wonderful 2 days discussion, people starting to bump elbows and standing back a little bit. And then that's when everything shut down. So it's literally for me been a year since I've been out meeting other people. The main thing really for the big change that's happened in my very, very personal life is that my street has become connected. So I live on a street in Oxford that actually people weren't very connected. We didn't really know each other. Lots of cars drive up and down, but we weren't connected. And at the beginning of this crisis, somebody went up and down the street, took everybody's phone numbers, created a WhatsApp group. And that's been actually a real source of hope and inspiration to me, to know that actually out of crisis on a very micro scale, people can connect and look out for each other and pick up each other's medicines and lend each other's things and keep each other laughing. And I know that we want to stay connected as a street after this. But I should also say I'm a parent of 12-year-old twins. And that means I've been doing a lot of homeschooling, especially in the first lockdown we had when there was no school provided. And so I really felt the intensity of the household economy and not being able to see my parents. And I realize what I'm saying is the reality for millions of people worldwide, in Sweden and far beyond. So this is an experience that many of us have had, that some people have had far more tragic and dramatic experiences at the household level and lost family members. I've been very fortunate not to, but it has really brought home the intensity of that space of unpaid caring work in the household. And it, for me, it reinforces the importance of looking at the lens through donut economics that realizes the economy is not just the market, it's here in our homes. And sometimes the work is forced back into our homes, and it's hard work. And if we don't recognize it, we don't recognize the strains it can create. So I think COVID's been an extraordinary experience, so differently experienced around the world, and yet we've all experienced it in some ways. And there's something unifying about that.
Mm. No, I think, and also, of course, because I think you're now pointing us towards the unifying elements of this. And not the least, maybe for a lot of us that have been able to work and exist in very specialized economies where, you know, you don't have to do everything. A lot of other people provide services for you, and suddenly you stand there, you have to do it on your own. But of course, there's reasons to talk about this as a very dividing point in time also, I guess. But I think that maybe we can come back to that, but I think it's a good thing to just touch base. Where are we? Because it is a year. It is a year with this pandemic. But I wanted to talk about time again, but I wanted to ask you what you think should be the economist for the 21st century. So not only for this position, but for that big point in time where we are. How would that be different than being an economist in the 1950s or the 1890s or something like that?
So you pointed out at the beginning that I call myself a renegade economist. And the reason for that is because ever since I left university, having studied economics for 4 years, I never introduced myself as an economist. It was something I was embarrassed to say. I mean, really, when you meet somebody at a party or an event, hello, I'm an economist, most people, I'll go somewhere else. And also I became embarrassed of the frameworks that I'd inherited and what's associated with that way of thinking. So I never called myself an economist for decades, in Zanzibar, at the UN, at Oxfam. And it was actually only when I drew the donut diagram and started coming back towards this, and somebody said, oh, you're a renegade economist. And I thought, aha, with that, I can come back into this space, because immediately it says, I'm talking economics, but I'm going to disrupt it because I don't agree with it. So that's for me the starting point. And I like to go back to the ancient Greek roots of this word economics. What does it come from? It comes from two words, ekos and nomos, which means the art of household management. Now, when we take it back to that, now that's something quite extraordinary. The art of household management. And in fact, in ancient Greece, the first book that was written, called The Economist, was about managing your own household, literally your estate. How do you allow your wife to get involved in managing your financial affairs? Do you trust your slaves? How do you manage your fields, your grain, your cloth? And then it went from the household level to the city level, then to the national level. And I believe we are in the era where we need to take economics to the planetary level. So the household that we need to concern ourselves with is the living world, the whole planet. And so when you say, well, economics, what if it's the art of household management? Well, the first thing you do is understand the household. How absurd to rush in and think you can manage something if you don't even understand it yet. So it starts with understanding, what is this living planet, this only one that we know of in the universe? How does it work? What are the core life-supporting systems that sustain her? And I have to say at this point that what drove me to draw the donut was seeing the diagram of 9 planetary boundaries, which was created by Johan Rockström, Sweden's own, right? So this donut has very Swedish origins. I came back from maternity leave in 2009 to Oxfam, and I saw this diagram of planetary boundaries with a round circle of the Earth with these big red lines shooting out because we were overshooting our pressure on the climate and on fertilizer and on land. And this was created by Johan Rockström and others. And I thought that is the beginning of 21st century economics, because it starts with the planetary household. But if we want to manage the planetary household, we also have to ask, manage it for what? And who are the inhabitants of the planet? And it's humanity and the rest of the living world. But specifically, let's talk about humanity. Who are we? What are we like? what's necessities in our lives. So let's start with humanity, not the old economic model that we were told we are, which is a very thin and narrow description of us, but let's start with the richness of who we actually are. We're a deeply social animal. We survive and thrive on collective, on collaboration, on reciprocity, and we have needs, which we've come to call human rights. So I drew an inside circle in this diagram of planetary boundaries. If there's an outer limit of pressure on the planetary household, there are also inner claims that every human being has. And it suddenly came out looking like a donut. So a 21st century economist is someone who managed the planetary household in the interest of all Earth's inhabitants. And if we can start by defining economics as that, well, suddenly I'm running back. I want to be part of this. I want to be part of this rewriting. And I want every student who's currently studying economics to be given the education that gives them the tools they need to do this well into the 21st century.
I think that's maybe you could even tell us a bit about, show us this diagram that you sort of developed from Johan Rockström's model.
Yes, indeed. And I'm going to learn to say Johan Rockström as well as you say Kate Raworth. His name is definitely more difficult than mine.
Absolutely. Silly dots over.
Here's the donut. So I offer this as an idea for a compass for humanity's prosperity in the 21st century. So what's going on here? If you imagine humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the center of this picture, it means that the hole in the middle of the donut is a place where people are falling short on the essentials of life. It's where people don't have the resources they need to have food, water, healthcare, education, energy, housing, income, political voice, gender equality. These 12 social dimensions here, I have crowdsourced them from the world's governments. They are the 12 social dimensions set out in the Sustainable Development Goals that all the world's governments agreed in 2015. And the power of that is that every government in the world has already agreed that every person in the world has a right not to live in this hole of the donut.
But a lot of people do.
And a lot of people do, absolutely. A lot of people are here. So we need to get everybody out of this space of deprivation over this social foundation. That's one side of the story. And you could say that a lot of 20th century economics was actually focused around creating jobs so that people had income and the state has revenue so that we could provide for these human wants and needs. So let's get everybody out the hole. What Johan's work and others did with the 9 planetary boundaries is to say, aha, but there's a very big but here. As we use Earth's resources to meet people's wants and needs, there is also an outer ring here, what I've called the ecological ceiling, beyond which we must not go. Because if we go beyond that, we use Earth's resources in such a way that we begin to push beyond the pressures of, we begin to push our life-supporting systems of planet Earth out of balance. And so we cause climate breakdown. We acidify the oceans. We create a hole in the ozone layer. We break down the web of life. We use too much fertilizer, convert too much land, withdraw too much water. We destroy Earth's life support systems on which we utterly depend to have food and water and health and security and housing. So these are completely interdependent. Now, that's the long story. If I put it very simply, the goal of the donut is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet, to live in this space in between. It's that simple. Now, some people would say, well, that's a radical idea. And others will say, well, it's actually, surely that's just common sense. But for me, this should be the starting point of 21st century economics. Here is the household. Here are the core needs of her inhabitants. Now, how do we design economies? How do we design government regulation and markets and prices and incentives and our relationships and finance that enables us to live in this space in between? That, to me, is the task of the economic student and the professor and the economic practitioner and the policymaker.
Yeah. But, and can I then ask you, because you said this, that a year ago you were actually meeting people at the European Commission, which is, if not else, that's a place for power. Not all power, of course, but for power. did you feel that you were close discussing, like real tools to do this, to get started, to get practitioners working on this? Were you hopeful when you came back?
Yeah, I was. So this takes us to a really interesting question of where does change happen? And let's talk about paradigms or worldviews. Where do we change from one kind of economy to another? And there are many different points at which you can intervene in a system. And people run campaigns and spend their whole life campaigning and dedicated to lobbying and working within or on the outside, shaking a fist or creating incentives within, trying to change systems. And there are many places you can intervene. For me, the place that I'm most persuaded by, and it's the work of a brilliant systems thinker called Donella Meadows. She wrote a book called Thinking in Systems. She said, look, we can intervene by lobbying a government to change the tax rate, to change the tax on something to protect the environment. You can make a little tweak in a system, which actually could have quite a big effect. But there are many, many different places you can intervene. And if you want to go for really the top intervention point, the place you intervene is in the mindset that we bring, in the way we think. So what we even see is the economy, what we include and what we exclude, what the pictures are that are in our minds and on the page before us. And that's what I've been trying to do with donut economics. So I know there are many, many ways to make change at the European Union. I mean, some amazing organizations have spent decades lobbying them to bring in a regulation to change the tax rate. That really matters. And another place where you can influence is by holding up a donut on a stick and saying, hey, what if we aim for this? And what's extraordinary is that people are motivated when they see a different picture. And the power of pictures, as I wrote about in the book, the power of pictures connect with our thinking. And so when I was in the European Commission, exactly on this day last year, I was with the people in the Commission who had said, we want to bring this in. So I didn't knock on any doors. I didn't make any phone calls. We didn't lobby. We didn't try to gain access. In fact, that's not the way we work. The way we work at Donut Economics Action Lab is to say, let's go where the energy is, because there are so many change makers out there who already want to do this. So we were invited by quite senior people who were like civil servants within the European Commission, a group of them across the Commission. We want to see if we can bring this into our institution. So we spent 2 days with them. And they were thinking, how can we lobby our managers? How can we bring this in? So we were really dancing with the ideas. We're never pushing, because there are people everywhere who already see differently. And they actually are very well placed to figure out how to convince my institution to start working with this too.
I'm thinking about a quote in your book, actually, now when you speak like this, and you write that economics is the mother tongue of public policy. And I imagine that this is what you're talking about now, that's not only imagery, but the way we speak and the way we name, of course, a value of a resource, for example, or the cost of something that's going on. So could you expand a bit about this economics as a mother tongue of public policy?
So there's a brilliant cognitive linguist called George Lakoff, who for decades has been studying language and pointing out that everything we say actually is filled with metaphors. And we need to pay attention to the metaphors we use to describe, because they carry a lot of weight and they shape how we think. In donut economics, I put a lot of attention on pictures that we see with our eyes. And we can also then put a lot of attention on words that we speak and hear. So together, these influence the way we imagine the world. So I wrote that economics is the mother tongue of public policy, because when I was working at the UN and when I was working at Oxfam, even though we were working on issues like human rights and access to healthcare, access to education, trade policy, injustices impacting on people in low-income countries, it was always the economists' analysis from these big institutions that somehow held more weight than others. In the United States, the president's Council of Economic Advisors, everybody's heard of it. And when there's a new president, as we've just seen, oh, who's on the Council of Economic Advisors? You know, the president has a council of scientific and environmental advisors too, but no one's running off their names. We think of people in power holding the economists close. and talking about the cost benefit analysis. So it's close in power. And when on a panel or on the news or on the radio, someone says, well, now we have an opinion from The Economist, most people are a bit intimidated by economics. They didn't study it. They think it's very mathematical, very technical. Oh, here comes the expert now telling us that it is worth it or the cost is too high. And that's really dangerous because it's just one perspective and it's a very narrow perspective. So The Economist is very dominant in political life and in policy making, but also in public life. Certainly in the UK and the US, over the past 3 decades, the neoliberal agenda that was brought in first by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan means that even the way we talk about ourselves and the social institutions of which we're part has been economized. So if you do a search in the English language of the use of the word citizen, it got overtaken by the word consumer some decades ago. And people say, oh, we're consumers. What do consumers want? I think, I'm not a consumer. I'm a resident, I'm a citizen, I'm a member of society, and sometimes I buy things in shops, but I am not a consumer. But this language from economic framing of the market relation comes dominant. In health and education, particularly in health services, hospitals now get called service providers. No, this is healthcare, and these are doctors providing care. So there's a real danger that we put market relations in the front of actually what are profoundly social relations. So that's why I see economics as the mother tongue, for better or for worse. And I think it's far too dominant. And that's why I want to actually get in there, be part of rewriting economics. But I believe many, many more voices should be heard and respected equally in public policy making.
But you're also not saying, so let's do away with economists in this, but rather let's rethink what economists should do, should care about, or should consider and focus on. But I think that, of course, and I think you're aware of this, that, I mean, we've had sort of the same development in Sweden, and we could discuss specific words. We could discuss the fact that we have actually made our school system a market with a very specific construction where actually you can start a school as a company and be really sure that you will get income from the state without really, and you can make profit out of that. In a way that's actually quite unique in the world as it is now. So among Swedish people, I think what you say now will resonate. But of course, we don't think the same way about this. There is also a feeling, I think, among many people, a feeling, a thought. I'm not going to say that this is not thinking, because it is, that but we get much more focus on quality now, and we're measuring things. We're not just trusting the government, and the market will actually tell us what is the best school. Isn't that a good thing? I mean, if people can be customers and choose the school that's best for their children.
Well, going back one step, so even in government-run schools, we can measure things. My children go to government-run schools in the UK. And there's a lot of measurement of their performance, of how they are how they perform when they enter the school, and the improvement that each child makes by different income backgrounds, by different racial backgrounds. So there's a lot of measurement, and there's absolutely no need for the private sector to be involved to make that work. But excuse me, person. Thank you very much. I'm in the middle of doing an interview, so you shouldn't be. This is some of my homeschooling is sneaking in the back of the door. Oi, thank you.
Hi.
A child snuck open the door and pushed a parcel onto my floor. I didn't put my sign outside saying do not disturb. So even with government-run schools, though, I mean, my children go to government-run schools, state schools in the UK, and there's a lot of measuring that goes on, maybe even too much measuring. I'd rather they got on were more creative, and it's continually, because of the government, requiring measurement. But there's also a real benefit to that measurement. Looking at children when they come into the school from different income backgrounds, racial backgrounds, gender, and then looking over time how they perform through the school, and are all different kinds of children getting support. So there's nothing inherent about bringing in the market that means we need to measure. I don't know enough about the Swedish system, but I do know that there's a risk when you have markets that people then, who has access to pay for that? Do you get a voucher? Do you get clusters of schools that are very well performing? Do parents... I don't know about the scheme by which that market works, because I don't think education is a true market. And let me come to the question of markets, right? Markets are very, very powerful tool. And I wouldn't want to live in a society and economy that did not use the tool of markets in some spaces. Adam Smith was right. There's something phenomenal about the market mechanism, the price mechanism, that sends a signal that can coordinate the wants and needs and the offers and the purchases of millions, billions of people who never need talk, but can have their activities coordinated through that price mechanism. It's incredible. But there are two big caveats. One, markets serve those who can pay and the rest they ignore. And markets value what's priced and the rest they exploit. Now, I don't know how that plays out in the Swedish school system, but does everybody have an equal capacity to pay for those services? And if the markets are valuing what's priced, what is showing up in the price and the basis on which those schools are then making a profit? And what isn't showing up? And is that being given equal attention? So I chose to send my children to a state school because I believe that education should be accessible to everybody equally, regardless of their parents' ability to pay. You could introduce a market-based system. I don't know enough about your Swedish detail, but I'm very concerned about the use of markets in the UK National Health Service, for example, which I hear from people internally. The contracts, the endless contracting and market recontracting is a distraction from getting on with delivering a public service well. Public services can also be brilliantly delivered. We've seen so many examples of private sector corruption, private sector failure in the UK particularly, that the idea that the state is incompetent and that the market is somehow inherently efficient is really a myth. And I think we've been sold it certainly through the neoliberal story of economics, and it's really time to redress that. And the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who's done great work on the entrepreneurial state, is showing that the state can be just as effective, often more effective than the market, because it can run on a logic of different values.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, and we're not going to stay with the Swedish schools, but I think this discussion you're having now on markets is really interesting. But I would also like to connect it, and maybe we even come back more to the ecological dimensions, but also connect it to the concept of the commons. Because, as you say, yes, markets are powerful tools. There is, of course, you can think a lot about that. But in your book, you're pretty clear about exactly what you said. You think they can be useful. But what about commons then? In what way can they be useful? And where should we have maybe more of commons? Do you see anything?
Yeah, so let me bring another diagram. The value of lockdown is that you get to make lots of cardboard pop-ups. Okay, so this is the diagram. This is the diagram that I start teaching economics with. Once I've introduced the donut as the goal, then I say we need a big picture. Right? If we don't have a big picture, we don't know where we are. So let's start by recognizing the economy is a subset of society. It's a social construct totally invented through human relationships, and human society exists within the living world. So let's just get that relationship right first. But then let's look inside the economy. There are 4 fundamental ways in which we provision for our wants and needs. Most economics starts on day one, actually, just with the market. Doesn't introduce any of this context, just goes in with the market. Supply and demand with the strengths and the caveats that I've already mentioned. And then says, well, sometimes the market will fail and we need the state to step in with public goods services. And much of 20th century economics, and certainly my economic textbooks, just focused on the play between these. A lot of political debate in the 20th century was like an ideological boxing match between free market laissez-faire capitalism and state-loving socialism. And which side are you on? Honestly, most people, I think, realize that you need to live in a society that uses both of these tools because they each do things that the other one cannot. But this is what shows up in GDP or national income. This is what gets measured at the end of the year to tell us whether the economy's grown or not. But this ignores 2 fundamental sources of our well-being, which are essential every day. And let's just start here in the household, where we've all been locked down for the past year, certainly in the UK. This is the space of unpaid caring labour in the home. It's the cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, raising the children, educating the children, getting your family members back to health. the unpaid caring work that makes families work and actually that can often make life worth living. But then, as you mentioned, there is the commons. And this is a place, it's so ignored in mainstream economics. You open a mainstream textbook, there won't be any mention of it. What you'll hear is the tragedy of the commons. That's all you hear. A man called Garrett Hardin wrote an article in the late 1960s saying that the commons, and let's imagine them as sort of shared grazing pasture where everybody can graze their sheep. Well, if it belongs to everybody, then everyone will put too many sheep on the commons. They'll eat all the grass and it will be destroyed, he said. It's a tragedy. And the recommendation was either privatize it or put it under the state. So get rid of that. Elinor Ostrom, the brilliant political scientist, came along and she said, well, hang on a minute. I can see lots of places in the world where these commons are actually working. So rather than theorize that they will fail, I'm going to go and visit them and find out what makes them work. And so she went to the rice paddies of India and Nepal. She went to the lobster fishermen of New England. And she said, the commons can work. And so let's just start by, what is the commons? The commons, and the way I think of it is this. It's a way and a place where people come together, not through the market, not through the state, but as a community, and say, we're going to co-create something that we collectively value. And it could be a neighborhood garden on the corner of the block where you live. And everybody on the block helps make that garden. And everybody knows the rules about what we do here and what we don't do here and how we collectively use it. It could be Wikipedia on the World Wide Web. And anybody can sign up and edit Wikipedia, but there are things you can do and there are things you can't do. And if you do the wrong things, you'll be punished. Commons have rules. And commons exist when there are commoners, people, who say, let's get together, let's create these rules, let's recognize who's part of this and how we're going to manage and steward this resource. Even some of the world's most successful software, Linux, began open source like a commons and is now used by some of the most biggest companies like Microsoft. So the commons is actually a really valuable way of organizing, equally as valuable as any of the others. It just follows a different logic and a different set of rules. And I think many people in countries that have gone very much into this market language and you're a consumer and this is a service provision, people think, hang on, I'm a community member. And in our community, there are shared things that we all value, like having a neighborhood garden, like maybe closing the street once a year and having a street party. That's a commons, because it only exists if we all create this together. And so we're beginning to learn again the rules through which we can actually make these work. So Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to get a Nobel Prize in economics, showed that the commons don't have to be a tragedy. They can be a triumph, but we need the clear rules and we need to learn those practices. And by the way, it's the opposite of the rational economic man of 20th century economics, which is all about self-interest and competition. The commons to work called the opposite. It's about collectivity, collaboration, open communication, shared goals, and punishing people if they violate the rules. It's not all cuddly and cozy. It's about clear rules and boundaries and what you can and can't do. And it can succeed. So I think we're seeing a return to interest in the commons, right from the level of your neighborhood block, let's make a community garden, all the way up to, actually we should recognize that the atmosphere and having a stable climate is a global commons for everybody who's alive today and for all future generations to come. It's not a market, we can't price it, it's a commons, and therefore how should we be managing it collectively? How should we be respecting it in that sense? The last thing I'll say is that Elinor Ostrom did give a warning, which is, of all the principles that make commons work well, you need people to be able to come together, to have that shared vision, to trust each other, to be able to connect so that they keep rebuilding those social relations. So that there are reasons why it's easier to build a commons in a particular place amongst people who will see each other in the market and say, hey, you pinched a carrot from the community garden, what are you doing? Where we will punish each other in that social way. It's much harder to build a commons at the global scale. But this is part of the work we need to do in terms of building 21st century institutions that recognize these possibilities.
Mm. Well, I guess you pointed to really the big challenges here. We all live in a place, but more and more people are, even under lockdown, actually working on a global scale. I mean, you're like selling your labor power or your services, whatever, even on a global scale. So there's a lot of challenges there. Even though I know this might be a bit of a, I mean, your mind moves between the community garden and our planetary boundaries very fast, and I find it fascinating to try to travel with you. But I'm also sitting here in a European welfare state, or maybe it's a post-welfare state. That's a discussion we're having. But what are in a society like that? What are the challenges? How could we move? Because I'm thinking about distribution and redistribution. These are also concepts often used in economics. To me, it seems like some of the societies that were really good in creating institutions for redistribution, as you mentioned, the NHS in UK, but also in many other places, we've created those kind of systems. But can we regenerate the sense for distribution? Trying to use some of your concepts. Do you understand what I'm meaning? I mean,
So, but I'm going to start by recognizing, as you just said, that you're sitting in Sweden, I'm sitting in the UK. So we are both in two of the richest countries in the world. And that matters. We are not only in countries that are richer than almost any country has ever been historically, in terms of the amount of income that's generated per person in the population, but also, along with that financial richness of our countries, what we also have in common is that our countries have massive ecological footprints on the planet in terms of carbon emissions and in terms of material use from around the world. And I'm not talking just about carbon emissions within Sweden or the UK or materials used. I'm talking about all the carbon and materials embedded in the food we import, the clothes we buy, the consumer goods we purchase, the construction materials that are imported, and the stream of waste that goes out again. So if we're going to talk about distribution, I'm going to talk first about redistribution between the global north, our countries, and the global south. The first responsibility of our nations is to massively reduce our pressure on planetary boundaries. I believe that's why people like Johan Rockström and others drew that diagram, and to help us see very clearly that we are in overshoot. And actually, I never talk about developed and developing countries anymore, because I can't think of a single country that has the right to call itself developed. Even the high-income countries like ours actually are not developed, because we are destroying the life-supporting systems of the planet in the way we live. So our first distributional obligation is to come back within planetary boundaries. That means creating a very low carbon economy, and it means creating a circular economy where the materials we already have are used again and again and again. By the way, as we know, there are huge opportunities in that. Huge opportunities for creativity and reinventing business and new design, and young students who are studying these fields of circular design, new material design, renewable energy, have the opportunity to put those skills into practice if our governments create the regulation that actually says we're going to do this. So that's the first obligation of distribution. But you're asking particularly about distributions maybe of income and opportunity within a nation, within a, as you said, maybe a post-welfare state. I would say also, another thing our economies have in common is that we've gone up the growth curve, that expectation that growth will be endless. And for this, I need my favorite toy, which is my hose pipe, because it can become anything. So there's the 20th century shape of progress, right?
Yeah.
In every economics textbook, underneath every economics conversation, the assumption is that is what progress looks like. And no matter how rich the country already is, it still goes up. It goes up endlessly. And yet nothing in nature succeeds by doing this. In nature, growth curve is like that. It's an S shape.
Yeah.
So what if we live in countries that are actually somewhere at that top of that S shape and need to learn to stop growing and come to thrive in balance? Then, if that's the case, then the distributional question becomes even more pointed, because, as you said, we can't just assume that we'll grow and grow and that this will remove poverty. Don't worry, you'll catch up. It will trickle down. No. Maybe our economies aren't going to keep growing. So the question of distribution becomes very specific. Now, many people, so I believe, I'm going to go back here actually, I believe that every person needs to have access and a claim of access to all four of these forms of provisioning. We know that in welfare states, and we call them welfare states because what they promise is that everybody has access to state services of health, state services of education. We all have access to public goods of the streets and the public goods. And this, let's call these universal basic services, and they are crucial and worth protecting. There's now a rise of people saying, well, actually, maybe we need everybody to have a committed access to the market, because there are many products and services that we need that we can't get through the state. And therefore, this is, I see as a reason why there's a rise and increase in a universal basic income. What if we could have a universal basic income that actually enables people to meet their essential needs? And what's really interesting around the universal basic income debate is, I mean, I'm not somebody who says I believe it's right or I believe it's wrong. Let's try. I mean, let's learn, right? The economy is a complex system, and no policymaker or theorist can, I think, reliably say, if you do this, that's what will happen. We don't know. So the smartest thing to do is experiment. And more countries have been doing experiments with a universal basic income and actually it's not universal, it's for people who are living below the median wage. What the finding is that the expectation is sometimes, oh, well, people will be lazy. They won't bother to work anymore. They'll just sit back and live off the state. We don't want that. Actually, what seems to be happening in practice is that people can say, now that I've got a guaranteed income, something like $500 a month coming in, I know that if I take that risk, I won't be destitute if it doesn't work out. So I'm going to take that risk. Or I can now afford to take time off my part-time job to go for an interview for a full-time job. Or I can even now afford the train fare to get to the interview. And people are actually stepping up in life. So there's something really interesting about the role that a basic income can play in enabling people to get out of a poverty trap and actually leap forward in their own independence in life.
Well, in a sense, I guess we're opening a whole new discussion here, which I think is really interesting, but I just don't think that we're gonna be able to make it all the way down. But I think it's also very good that you told me that we need to think in this global setting, which we're all in. There are planetary boundaries, but so I think that we will have to sort of round up this conversation in a little while, but we started by talking, well, from the point of view of you being in lockdown because of COVID, because of actually a global event that was quite hard to predict. Not that a pandemic was something unheard of, but there has been maybe it's panic, but also kind of political readiness to react to whatever happened. And it's going to take a long time until we can close the books on what was good or bad, etc. There's a lot of very hefty debate on this, of course. But do you think there's anything either very good or very bad coming out of this that will change the prospects of what you're working for, namely for us coming inside the donut? Do you have any thoughts on this now, what you see exactly in this year, in this, have things changed?
Yes, so I think that rather than taking just the COVID crisis alone, I like to just begin by thinking that the 21st century has actually begun with repeated crises. I mean, we are in an era of recurring crises. The first one that we'll remember is the 2008 financial crisis. It was financial meltdown. And we are in an era of climate and ecological breakdown. And we see fires and floods and storms in the news every day. And now we are intensely in this crisis of COVID lockdown. But all of these, to my mind, highlight sharp inequalities of gender and of race and of wealth and power and global north and global south in terms of how the impacts of these crises fall on people's lives. But they also highlight how deeply interconnected our lives are with each other and the rest of the living world. Most of all, though, I think all three of them, finance, climate, and COVID, all three of them emerge from the fact that we've created systems that depend upon endless expansion. So the financial system tries to endlessly expand, you're going to get a subprime mortgage market pulling it down from the bottom. We aim to endlessly expand our use of fossil fuels and Earth's resources. It induces climate and ecological breakdown. And human settlements are endlessly expanding into wildlife areas, combined with an endless increase in travel between nations. And this creates the conditions for zoonotic disease transfer and a global health pandemic. So we've in systems that are aiming to endlessly expand, and we need to move away from that. And that's why the donut, which symbolizes not endless expansion but balance, is a different paradigm. It's coming back to that fundamental mindset. Now, I first drew the donut in 2012. It's had traction and interest amongst governments, I'd say, since about 2017. But the last year has definitely increased the interest. And I think it's because Amsterdam, which had taken it early and got really interested in it and created an Amsterdam donut portrait and put it at the heart of the city's vision for circularity, Amsterdam released this portrait of itself through the lens of the donut in April 2020. That was the month that Amsterdam had its highest rate of COVID infection. So in the midst of their COVID crisis, they released a report saying this is our vision for the future of our city and it looks like a donut. And as the deputy mayor, Marieke van Doornik, would say, you know, sometimes it's actually in the darkest hour that you can most need to see the light. So when you're going to emerge from emergency, where are you going to go? Who are you going to become? And what I've been seeing is, particularly at the city level, there's something about the dynamism of cities. Particularly at the city level, policymakers saying, look, we can't have one strategy for finance, one strategy for climate, and one strategy for COVID. These things connect, and we need to re-envision the place we want to be. So from my point of view, COVID has pushed policymakers further forward to something that 5 years ago, donut economics might have seemed a bit of a radical idea. And now it's something that a lot of policymakers are reaching for because it helps to make sense. I will add lastly that, as I began by saying, I'm pointing out some of the things that unify our experiences of COVID. And as you say, it can also be very divisive. And I think what's also highlighted is the difference between people whose income depends on markets in which they earn a wage. And they literally need to go to places where they can physically earn a wage, or they earn a daily wage, versus people who own assets, who own land, who own housing, who own businesses, who own shares, and that they are receiving a dividend, a rent continually. And so it highlights the difference between people who depend upon the daily work that they do and those who reap an income because they own things. And I think it's very important to highlight that. So when people early on in the crisis said, I cannot pay my rent, you know, the landlord wants their rent because they own the building, but I can no longer go to work. So I'm caught in between the two. And I think it's really important to look again, and this goes back to the distributional question, can we create a more equitable distribution of the sources of wealth creation? Look again at who owns the land in the city, who owns the utilities of energy and water, who owns the businesses, and can we create more locally community or employee-owned businesses rather than buying from multinational companies where the rents are taken out to shareholders who don't do the work, but they just happen to have the money to own the shares. So I think that's a really important part. Lastly, I'll say one thing that COVID's done is shown us that governments can act fast when they decide to. They can literally over the weekend get homeless people off the streets and into a hotel or a hostel. They can introduce furlough and pay the wages of the nation. They can shut the borders and ground the airplanes and close the schools. It's extraordinary what they can do when they choose to. So the neoliberal idea that the state is incompetent, that the state is sort of withered away and that it all depends upon the market, no way. And so we must hold that memory and that recognition of the breadth of things that governments can do and say, right, now let's also apply that action and that vision to tackling the climate and ecological crisis that we face. And let's look at it not just in COVID times, but in long times, how we create a redistributional society that doesn't see huge income inequalities widening up in a nation like Sweden that people worldwide think of as being one of the more equal societies in the world. How do we hold on to that value that for which we're admired and actually which matters hugely at home as well? So I think this is a real opportunity to expect more from government because they've proven that they can do so much.
Well, thank you, Kate. I think that was a wonderful, well, not last words, but a mass of last thoughts here. And I'm just going to just going to do a bit of a commercial, but I just say that your book is actually an excellent Swedish translation. It's available. And I'm so happy that you were here.
I have my Swedish copy right here.
Good.
I have to say, I love the cover. This was a beautiful, elegant, very Swedish, beautiful design. So yeah.
I agree. I of course looked up your English version too, and the students at my university, Gothenburg University, actually has it as a on their reading list. So I went to the library, and yes, I think the Swedish cover looks better. Okay, but thank you so much from us here in Gothenburg. Thank you for taking your time, and please send our wishes to the person who entered your room, the homeschooled person.
I will do. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. And it's lovely to talk because, as I said, the donut originally, the outside the donut, it has a very Swedish twist thanks to Johan Rockström. So it's really lovely to connect again and show how ideas build on ideas. And who knows, maybe somebody in Sweden will take this and add the next layer to it and take it further again. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate Raworth. And nu pratar jag lite svenska igen. Tack för er som har tittat. Som sagt var, det här var en sorts första avsnitt av vår tids tänkare när vi pratade med Kate Raworth. Och återigen, det var Göteborgs Litteraturhus, Folkuniversitetet, Bokförlaget Daidalos, Tidskriften Ord&Bild. Och det var också Mattias Ruiz-Tagle som filmade det här. Tack så mycket till alla.